In addition to plants, some species of animals were also domesticated. The number of animal domesticates in the New World was much lower than the number of animal domesticates in the Old World, and many of the animals that we know of as domesticates, like sheep, goats, cattle, pig, and chickens, were domesticated in the Old World. In the New World, turkeys, llamas and alpacas, guinea pigs, and a variety of duck, the Muscovy duck, were domesticated. The first humans to colonize the New World likely brought dogs with them. Dogs are the earliest domesticated animal and were domesticated about 35,000 years ago from the wolf. And this occurred in Eurasia, and recent genetic studies suggest there may have been multiple independent centers of wolf domestication across Europe and Asia, and that not all of these episodes of domestication continued to contribute to modern domesticated dog lineages. The context in which this domestication has occurred was when people and wolves competed for the same resource. They both hunted reindeer, and people may have killed adult wolves in order to eliminate competitors. However, they may have kept young wolves to assist them in hunting, especially helping track wounded animals. Now, these young wolves, the pups, would have been selected for tameness, non-aggressive behavior, and their intelligence, and that those puppies that were a bit too aggressive, if they bit too much, they would be bitten back after being cooked. Now, dogs are predisposed to domestication. They are social animals. They live in packs, and they want to fit into the pack and please the alpha member. Some of you may have seen the Nat Geo show, The Dog Whisperer, with Cesar Millan, and one of his sayings was, "You need to be the alpha of your pack." And that's one of the ways that people came to control dogs and their behavior, because dogs want to submit to a leader, want to fit into a group. The top photo shows one of my dogs, Courage, when he was about a year old. He's now gone to the great dog park in the sky. But there are big differences between dogs and wolves. One of the biggest differences is their size. Wolves are much larger, but also the ears. Notice how many domesticated dogs have floppy ears, whereas wolves have pointy ears. Also notice on the wolf how long their legs are. Changes in skeletal morphology, the size and shape of various bones, allow us to track these changes and measure the domestication of wolves into dogs. We see a reduction in size, which is especially apparent in the skull. The upper right-hand image shows side by side a domesticated dog skull on the left and a wolf skull on the right, and these size differences are readily apparent. And some of the size differences are due to the shortening of the muzzle. As you can see in the lower skulls, the dog's muzzle is much shorter than the longer wolf muzzle. Think of Little Red Riding Hood, and my, what a pointy nose you have, and I mean many long, sharp teeth. And because of the reduction in muzzle size, domesticated dogs' teeth become smaller due to crowding, and certain domesticated dogs have actually lost some of the teeth. Dogs with very short muzzles, like pugs and bulldogs. And also this shortening of the muzzle leads to what is called an indented rostrum. You can see how the slope of the wolf's forehead is fairly even and flat, whereas the slope of the dog's forehead is indented. Russian researchers discovered what at the time was the oldest known domesticated dog. More recent research has pushed the dates back from 14,000 years ago to nearly 35,000 years ago. But these dogs from the site Elisevice in Siberia were formally buried as though they were family members, not treated the same as animals that were killed and consumed as food. The researchers looked at the size and shape of the skulls and created a ratio to measure the length of the skull, its condylobasal length, the length from the base of the skull to the tip, and the width of the palate, because as the muzzle becomes shortened, the palate often becomes wider. So they measure the ratio of those two and compare it against the length. And in this analysis, they're able to show that wolves group into a particular category, and Siberian Huskies, which are often assumed to be very similar to the domesticated wolf, have some slight differences, having wider palates in relation to the length of the skull. Now, these earliest domesticates, marked in the stars, are outside of both of these ranges, and the researchers compared them to some different domesticated breeds from today, and they very closely match Great Danes, and in a later analysis they were found to almost perfectly match Tibetan Mastiffs. Now, these domesticates from Siberia, the skulls were very different from wolves, but the postcranial skeleton, their body, was still very similar to wolves. So think of Great Danes and Mastiffs, which are very large dogs that are bred as guard dogs and defensive dogs. They have very large bodies with long legs similar to wolves, but their heads have begun to transform to have these shorter muzzles and wider palates, indicating the emergence of domestication. Also, the treatment of these animals, their burial as though they were family members rather than being treated the same as animals that were consumed as food. One of the characteristics of domesticated dogs is that they maintain what's called a neonate appearance into adulthood. Neonate means newborn-like. And here is Courage, who we saw a few slides earlier, as a 1-year-old, as a puppy. And you can see that his face and head look very similar as a 6-week-old puppy as he does later when he is a year old. Puppies, not just domesticated dog puppies, but wolf puppies as well, have floppy ears, shortened muzzles, more forward-pointed eyes, and indented rostrum. But as wolf puppies mature, they grow up into big bad wolves with long pointy noses, sharp pointy ears, long pointy teeth. Dogs maintain that puppy-like appearance as they grow up. Two other characteristics commonly found in domesticated dogs that are not found in wolves are curly tails, and you can only slightly see Courage's tight curling tail in this photo. But many domesticated breeds have this curled tail, whereas wolves have very straight tails. Many domesticated varieties also have multicolored coats. Courage was largely black, but you can see a little white blaze on his chest and his chin, and he also had white on his toes. Other domesticated dogs have very variable coat colors, whereas wolves are generally a standard grayish color all the way across their body, without patches of different colors. Russian researchers working with fox breeders in the mid-20th century tried to breed more tame foxes. They raise silver foxes in order to harvest their furs. The foxes are kept in pens, and you would like tamer ones that didn't try to bite their keepers all the time when they tried to put food in their pens. And so they selected for tameness, non-aggressive behavior, and over a few generations these foxes transformed. They stopped looking like typical silver foxes. They started to have multicolored coats, floppy ears, and curled tails. And it may be that the genes that determine for these physical characteristics are co-located in the same area as the genes that determine for certain behaviors like tameness and non-aggressive behavior. The oldest dog in the Americas comes from a site in Texas called Hines Cave. In the photo above, you can see this cave on sort of the edge of a cliff, and you can see the rope that the excavators used to ferry equipment up to it. This was a very challenging excavation, but it was very rewarding because there were old deposits, and in deposits that date to about 9,400 years before present, they recovered this very small piece of dog bone. That scale is 1 centimeter. It is a small fragment that was recovered from a human coprolite, a preserved piece of human feces. Now, looking at that, people who aren't experts in analyzing bones would have a very difficult time trying to determine not only what kind of animal it came from, but perhaps what part of the body it came from. But someone who is very experienced in looking at bones notes right away that on the right-hand side you have some unusual features. And this is from the base of the skull. And it is a very identifiable piece despite the very small fragment. Now, from these characteristics, it couldn't be determined whether this was a domesticated dog, a wolf, or a coyote, but DNA extracted from the bone fragment showed that it was a domesticated dog, and most closely related to modern Peruvian Indian breeds. Finding the fragment inside a human coprolite shows that dogs sometimes served as food, that man's best friend could sometimes become man's meal of last resort, perhaps. As I mentioned at the very beginning, there were many fewer varieties of animals domesticated in the New World than in the Old World, and there were also much fewer varieties of animals domesticated than plants. In North America and Mesoamerica, there were independent episodes of domestication of wild turkeys. In South America, wild varieties of camels, the Huanaco and the Vicuña, were domesticated and transformed into llamas and alpacas. Guinea pigs were domesticated, and the Muscovy duck. Following this, we're just going to focus on turkeys and llamas and alpacas, but I would like to point out that guinea pigs were not domesticated in order to have cute little pets for kindergarten classrooms. When I was in kindergarten, we had a guinea pig named Peanut, and everybody got to bring him home over the weekend at some time during the school year. But everybody brought Peanut back. However, if a Peruvian or Bolivian child brought the guinea pig home, the guinea pig would likely be consumed. Guinea pigs were domesticated in order to eat them. And guinea pigs are still consumed in Bolivia and Peru and Ecuador and other areas of South America where the animal was originally domesticated. I have many colleagues who work down in Peru, and most of them have told me that once you arrive there as an American archaeologist, the Peruvian archaeologists tease you to no end that you're a gringo until you eat cuy, guinea pig. And there's a joke that most things taste more or less like chicken. Have you eaten alligator? It tastes more or less like chicken. Rattlesnake? It tastes more or less like chicken. So I asked one of my friends, so does guinea pig taste more or less like chicken? He says, no, it tastes a lot like duck. It's very greasy. Guinea pigs are very high in fat, and it's believed that prehistoric people may have domesticated them because of this fat. Prehistoric peoples living in the high Andes ate diets that were devoid of much fat, largely carbohydrates, potatoes, quinoa, which is a variety of grain, and llama meat, which is very lean. And living at these high altitudes, they needed fat. We were often trying to cut fat out of our diets, but prehistoric people were often trying to maximize the amount of fat because their diets were often dominated by simple carbohydrates. So guinea pigs were domesticated to be consumed and to provide this high-value fat that was absent in other parts of the diet. Like with plants, the domestication of animals was an evolutionary process that took place in the context of two interdependent historical processes, that of the animal genome and its mutation and recombination providing variation, and culturally determined human subsistence behaviors, how the people exploited different animal species. But it wasn't just how the animal species were used. People, after the adoption of agriculture, modified the environment and creating potential new habitats that were favorable for these animals, thus attracting them. Like with plants, the beginnings of animal domestication did not require any intentional actions of people. No one woke up and said, I'm going to go out today and domesticate a llama. But at some point, animal populations managed and selectively culled. Certain animals were killed, whereas others were allowed to live and pass their genes on to successive generations. Their movements began to be controlled, and supplemental feed provided to them. And people began to deliberately select for particular attributes, select for task performance or greater wool production, what we call selective breeding. Almost all domesticated animals, other than the dog and the cat, evolved from former prey species that became potential crop pests after plants were domesticated. Once people adopted plant cultivation, lived in single locations longer, had larger populations, and they made more extensive modifications of the environment, perhaps creating new habitats that were desirable to different animal species. So the evolution of domesticated animals is a co-evolutionary process where a change in human behavior, the adoption of agriculture, led to altered environments that may have enhanced habitats for these animals, because agricultural fields often are ideal foraging microenvironments for different animal species. Sometimes they want to eat the crops themselves. Other times they're going after insects that are found within these fields. Now, humans may have begun to use communal hunts in order to control crop predation by animals, just like they use communal hunts to catch lots of rabbits. Perhaps when you start planting quinoa in the highlands of the Andes, you don't like it when guanacos and vicuñas come and graze within your fields, so you began to use communal hunts in order to control this predation. But over time, these communal hunting methods may have shifted away from killing the whole herd that you capture to selectively killing animals of certain ages or certain sexes, killing off most of the males, leaving just ones with desirable traits to breed with the remaining females and pass those desirable traits on. And you begin to manage the population dynamics of the herd. So while domestication may have begun unintentionally, at some point people began to deliberately intervene in the reproductive cycle. A light bulb went off over their head, and they began to decide which desirable traits would be passed on. They would select for tameness and manageability, smaller size, less aggressive, those that are not afraid of or averse to humans. Now, this could be self-selected within animal populations. So within a population of wild camelids, guanacos, and vicuñas, some might already bear these genes that make them more manageable because they're less aggressive and not afraid of people. And those are the ones within the herd that would be more likely to go down into fields near human settlements and increase the potential for interaction among them, rather than those that lack those genes that make them more tame and not afraid of humans, who are less willing to move into those fields. So some of these characteristics could have been self-selected for within the animal populations. Now, people later began to select for different qualities that improved the ability of the animals to provide for humans, qualities related perhaps to their production of wool, milk, meat, or eggs, or their performance of certain tasks, being able to carry goods or pull vehicles. Perhaps the most important New World domesticate were two different varieties of South American camelids, the llama and the alpaca. Llamas were domesticated from the wild species known as the guanaco, whereas alpacas were domesticated from a different wild species, the vicuña. Vicuñas and guanacos use different habitats and environments, although they can slightly overlap. Vicuñas are primarily high elevation grazers of grass, whereas guanacos live from high elevations down into lower elevations and inhabit a greater variety of habitats: grasslands, shrublands, forests. The initial domestication of these animals is not well understood, but is believed to have occurred between 4,000 and 6,000 BC in the highland Andes. One of the reasons it is not well understood is several of the typical markers of domestication that are used for Old World large herbivores, like sheep, goats, and cattle, are absent in these New World camelids. We look at change in size, not just in body size, but in the size of the horns. Sheep, goats, and cattle, their horn size decreases as they're domesticated, as does their body size. But in the South American camelids, they don't have horns, and the body size is not substantially different from the wild ancestors. There is a significant overlap in body size between llamas and guanacos, as well as between alpacas and vicuñas. Subtle changes in dental morphology, changes in the size and shape of the roots of some molars, has been used to measure the transformation of guanacos into llamas and vicuñas into alpacas. Subtle changes in tooth morphology, changes in the size and shape of the roots of some molars, has been used to identify the transformation of guanacos into llamas and vicuñas into alpacas. But these changes are not easily measured, and some of the strongest evidence for when domestication occurs comes from the construction of facilities used to manage these animals. Corrals. In the lower left is a reproduction of a petroglyph panel, rock art, showing a herd of llamas and a herder, or actually two herders, and some of the llamas are within a corral. And these corrals, stone walls, are preserved on the landscape and associated with other artifacts that allow us to understand the time period within which they were used. Also, changes in the patterns of how the populations of animals were used, the age and sex profiles in the butchered remains. Because when people begin to manage herds, they begin to use them in different ways. When you're hunting them, you're hunting often on an encounter basis and taking whichever animals that you find. And so you have the entire range of the age and sex of a population within the butchered assemblages. However, in managed populations, you're often killing most of the males and killing them young, selecting only a few males to mature into adulthood, those that have the most desirable characteristics that you want to pass on to the next species. And rather than killing young females, you're conserving them, trying to maximize their reproductive capacity. And females are only butchered and killed once they have passed beyond their reproductive abilities. So you have young males and older females as the butchered remains. Llamas and alpacas were incredibly important in Andean economies, not just as a source of meat, but also as a source of wool. And in the center top, you see a woolen bag that has been woven from fibers that were gathered from llamas and alpacas and has representations of those camelids on it. But also, they were very important as beasts of burden, as animals that could carry packs and carry heavy burdens over long distances. And caravans of llamas could be used to carry large amounts of resources between different communities and also between different environmental zones. And when we talk about South American empires, the importance of camels will become very apparent. So here are some wild guanacos up in the high Andes in a mixed shrub and grassland environment. You notice they have generally a solid brown colored coat with light underparts and darker markings around their face. The coloration and patterning of the coats on domesticated llamas is much more variable. So this is similar in some ways to dogs. And once dogs were domesticated, one of the characteristics that seems to be associated with tameness and manageability is a greater variation in the color of their fur. We see the same thing in llamas. Llamas are still used as beasts of burden in many traditional Andean communities, and a llama can carry a load of 80 pounds. That's much more than a human can carry, and if you have a whole caravan of llamas, here we've got at least 5 llamas, 80 pounds each, that's 400 pounds of resources that could be carried. and large llama caravans could carry large amounts of bulk subsistence goods, moving high elevation products like potatoes down to lower elevation markets, and then moving low elevation products like cotton or corn or chili peppers to high elevation markets. Vicuñas are slightly smaller and more gracile than their guanaco cousins, and they live in a different habitat, whereas guanacos live from sea level all the way up to about 12,000 feet. Vicuñas specialize in these high elevation grasslands above 10,000 feet, and they primarily eat just grass, whereas guanacos will eat grasses and shrubs and any vegetable material that's available. Once again, vicuñas have a fairly consistent coat pattern, darker brown on top with lighter white underparts, and domesticated alpacas have greater variation in the color of their fur. You'll also notice that they are considerably more fuzzy, because people have selected for their wool producing capacity. And alpaca wool is highly prized for being very soft and having very long, strong fibers, which makes it excellent for making textiles. And the wool from alpacas and from llamas was a very important commodity in Andean economies. While llamas and alpacas lack the strong skeletal signatures that allow us to track migration, there's a great overlap in the size between the wild and domesticated varieties. They didn't lose their horns. The changes in the tooth size and shape are really subtle and difficult to measure and assess. And so DNA was applied to trying to understand the domestication of llamas and alpacas. And it was found that it's really not quite as simple as guanacos led to llamas and vicuñas led to alpacas because of hybridization. Llamas and alpacas can actually interbreed and create viable offspring. And so in the Andes, in the Aymara Indian language, an indigenous group that herds these camelids, a hybridized llama and alpaca is referred to a quora. And they actually have several different other hybrids. Is it 3/4 llama and 1/4 alpaca, 7/8 llama and 1/8 alpaca, or the opposite, 3/4 alpaca and 1/4 llama, 7/8 alpaca and 1/8 llama? And they have special terms for all these different varieties of camelids and hybrids. And so this intermixture and hybridization makes analyzing the genetic data more difficult. When the Spanish arrived, they found domesticated turkeys were used by people from Mesoamerica all the way up into the American Southwest, and it had long been assumed that the domestication of turkeys followed the domestication of agriculture, and corn, beans, squash, and turkeys together were all brought into the American Southwest as a package. However, more recent data is showing there was a much more complex and much more interesting story. Here we see 3 wild turkey toms displaying in order to impress females, and you can notice that their body color is generally uniform dark grayish brown, and they have white tips on their tail feathers. Domesticated turkeys have more variation in color, more mixed colors, and sometimes even solid white. So similar to mammals like dogs and the camelids, the genes that control for the color of the plumage, like the genes that control for the color of fur, may be co-located on the chromosome in the same area where those genes that determine certain behaviors that make the animals less averse to humans, less frightened and fearful of them. This is a representation of a turkey on a membrane pot, a bowl that was made in southwestern New Mexico, somewhere in the mid-1100s. Now, it had long been assumed that turkeys came as a package with corn, beans, and squash. We knew that corn was domesticated in Mesoamerica. We knew that beans and squash were too. However, recent evidence suggests that there were multiple independent centers of domestication for those plants, and it was assumed that turkeys just came along for the ride as corn and bean and squash seeds were exchanged from neighbors among neighboring populations, or as people bringing agriculture migrated into new areas, they brought domesticated turkeys with them. But recent analyses suggest a more complex picture, that there were two independent episodes of turkey domestication, one in Mesoamerica and one here in the U.S. Southwest. Building on research that had been done in order to determine the genetic diversity of wild turkey subspecies, researchers began to look at archaeological specimens and the DNA extracted from them and comparing them to the genetics of wild turkey subspecies. Domesticated turkeys in Mesoamerica and modern varieties of domesticated turkeys, those that had been imported to Europe from Mesoamerica and then re-imported into the United States by settlers coming from Europe, all derive from the southern Mexican wild turkey subspecies. But when archaeological specimens from the Four Corners region of the U.S. Southwest were analyzed, they were found to be unrelated to the southern Mexican wild turkey and more closely related to Gould's and Rio Grande wild turkeys, suggesting some domestication event somewhere in northern Mexico rather than in southern Mexico. These domesticates in the U.S. Southwest had further indications of interbreeding with the Merriam's turkey, that wild Merriam's turkeys were incorporated into these domesticated breeds that had been brought from further south in northern Mexico. And so the current thought is that as corn spread, people were modifying their environment, creating these fields of corn that would attract turkeys to them. Turkeys forage for insects and for sprouting weeds, and you're going to find lots of insects and sprouting weeds in fields that people have created. And it's beneficial for the people to have the turkeys in the fields, eating grasshoppers and other bugs that are going to be feeding upon their crops, and also eating the small sprouts of weeds that will compete with the crops for soil moisture. Historic Puebloan people would turn their flocks of turkeys out in the fields as a form of weed and pest control. And as wild animals started to come into the fields to forage, those that were less averse to humans were more likely to come into the fields closer to human settlements and begin to transform their interaction with humans, leading to ultimately their physical transformation into domesticated turkeys. So what to remember? Domestication is a co-evolutionary process that takes place in the context of two interdependent historical processes. On one hand, you have the plant or animal genome and the variation that's created within it through mutation and recombination, and culturally determined human subsistence behaviors that govern the interaction between human populations and these plant and animal populations. The beginnings of domestication did not require human intentionality. It was not some day that someone woke up and said, I'm going to go domesticate a plant or an animal. The process was unintentional. Humans' other behaviors interacted with the populations of animals and they began to change. But at a certain point, people did recognize this change and began to capitalize on it, beginning to deliberately plant seeds, beginning to save seeds in order to plant them the next year, not just to eat them over the winter, selecting certain seeds to plant, killing certain animals, killing the males, keeping the females. And so we begin to see transitions from the way people use the animals, from hunting and gathering them to actively managing the populations. Multiple lines of evidence can be used to identify domestication. For plants, we use macrofossils, the visible small fragments of preserved plants, and also more microscopic evidence, pollen, phytoliths, plant stones, these little bodies that form within the cell walls of plants to give them their rigidity, starch grains, and particularly DNA. With animals, we look at their bones and teeth, and changes in the size and shape indicating changes in the size and shape of the animal, and also using DNA. Some plants and animals were independently domesticated in different locations. It wasn't as though there was just one place where this event occurred. Human populations all over the Americas began to more intensively use different plant and animal species, sometimes the same plant and animal species in different areas. So for example, squash was independently domesticated in both the eastern woodlands of the United States and in Mesoamerica, and turkeys were independently domesticated in both Mesoamerica and the U.S. Southwest. The same sorts of contexts of changing interaction between plant or animal and human populations occurred in these different areas, leading to the transformation of these plant and animal species to better suit humans' needs.